Okay, thank you, Peter. So as I told you, my initiative with this call is to push a little bit the discussion of women and weapons in Latin America, taking into consideration that this is kind of a new field in Latin America. As you know, we have very violent countries, very violent cities, but since I think 4 years ago, our perspective of guns control was gender blind. It was only arms control, like campaigns to recover some weapons, restrictions in cities such as in Bogota, but we didn't include the gender perspective. And that was included like in 4 years ago when we started to consider in mainly the topic of toxic masculinities, violent masculinities that demand firearms to protect themselves, to protect the family and the community. Mainly in this perspective was the perspective of gender in guns control, considering mainly women as a victim in the house.
Yeah.
Women, like how the probabilities of gender violence and accident and suicides increase when you have a firearms at home. But we are starting in Amazuru to try to push the discussion to talk that women are also vulnerable as men in the public space. And
Yeah.
when we realize that context when violence increased a lot, violence against women with firearms in the public space increased even more than men. And that was very clear in the data, for example, of Mexico, when we have this very step increase of violence in the midst of the 20s, and violence of women increased more. And now we are seeing it in Ecuador, when violence is increasing a lot and women are more vulnerable in the public space by firearms. Also, when we break some information at the subnational level, we realize, for example, in Argentina, that is a country with very low homicide rates. We have in Santa Fe, which is this very violent provincia region, we have biggest, highest proportions of homicide and feminicide by firearm. So we started to push more the discussion on women and firearms in the public space. And your book, Peter, was very enlightening to show me that women also have agency, also have motivation to access firearms. So we started to think about what are these motivations or what are these cultural contexts, or as you pointed out in a chapter, how the industry pushes women to access firearms. So I know your book is settled mainly in the States, which is very important for Latin America, because we in Latin America, we feed on the culture of the United States. So we can see that Brazil,
It's to pardon you.
this is the context, and I sent you the question. It's just a little bit like try to discuss what are your perspective about the differentiated like motivations and roles of women compared to men. And you have many things in your book, but I wanted to push a little bit more on the violent use of firearms. Like how could be the patterns different of armed women, like in petty crime or organized crime or conflict, and what are your hypotheses on the difference on Latin America? So first, I wanted Peter to allow me to make an introduction to yourself, to the topic, with the question of what are your motivations to start to work on women and firearms and weapons.
Thank you for your introduction. There were many points you made that in different ways were part of the background that led me to come to the women and firearms issue. But as you noted, my own work was very much more specifically focused on the American gun market, and in a sense that I think is useful in some ways, but in other ways not quite as useful to you as you might hope. But it's how I got to it. You might wonder what someone from Britain, I mean, it's a low gun ownership country and there isn't much gun crime. You might wonder why someone would be working on these issues. Um, but I think that a number of the points made about women and their risk and vulnerability, even in a low gun ownership country, is still a problem, because the problem of quite a significant number of women are victims of gun violence in the home as part of a long process of domestic violence, and as they get older, some of these women are being shot by their partners. We've had a number of quite terrible family annihilations where the gun owner perhaps is becoming old and infirm, perhaps suffering some kind of dementia, alcoholism, other mental health problems, kills partner, self, pets, children, and you know, these kinds of tragedies. We've had a number of these tragedies where it's always men, it's never women. It's the man is usually the gun owner, and in some cases the guns are taken from the gun owner by the police as a result of various assessments made of their super suitability to own guns. And then because no court case follows and no conviction is secured, the police give the guns back. And I can think of 5 recent cases where the police have given the gun back, and then the guy has gone on and shot his partner and himself and other members of the household. So there is still this problem that the law takes a far too tolerant view of men as gun owners, and even in a country like Britain where gun ownership is supposed to be a privilege and not a right, um, the police are often reluctant to take appropriate action to remove guns from dangerous situations. But the issue with the gun market in America, for me, came out of a series of things. I mean, I was doing work on the global issue, you know, much like small arms survey. I use small arms surveys work a massive amount because it's really good. But the very stats tell you a story that something like 94% of the civilian-owned guns in the world are in the hands of men. And that's a massive imbalance. And around the world, there are lots of sort of unsuitable men with a kind of strange notion of masculinity who are perpetrating violence and rape against women, aided and abetted by the firearms they own. I mean, whether you look at South Africa, large parts of Latin America, Europe, even Britain, and certainly North America, this problem is truly global. At the same time, there has been a gun advocacy movement in America that's kind of reflected that whole, you know, it's very much an NRA-led initiative, the idea of don't refuse to be a victim. And at the same time, we've seen a sort of cultural phenomenon whereby women are certainly in the movies and in TV shows, women are as cops, as secret agents, or what was it? Resident Evil. Women are becoming kind of armed icons of femininity, and somehow this is being represented as a good thing. At the same time, we've had these long debates about the role of women in combat areas in the military. So a change is kind of coming, and I think the debates about that and the way in which the sort of risks faced by women, we've seen I think it's a perverted form of feminism being allied with a kind of neoliberal individualism to promote the idea that women can set themselves free from all this violence if only they carried a gun and were prepared to use it. Now, I think that is that is gun industry marketing. I don't think it's a real social movement, but of course that begs a particular kind of question. So we've seen the likes of the NRA promoting this sort of guns are ways of freeing yourself from rape culture. Guns are ways of, and I think this is heavily underpinned by racism, that as is much of the American gun debate, that white folks are supposed to kind of protect themselves from the black underclass by arming themselves. And I suppose we saw some of that in the context of the kind of the mobilizations around Trump and all he was trying to do during his first period in office. And you know, lots of states then went for concealed carry laws and stand your ground type laws, and this was supposed to be a kind of way of preventing crime. Except, as I tried to show in the book, a lot of it is a con, because the way in which popular conceptions of rape as stranger danger are mobilized in America, that the persons most likely to assault or kill a woman are people she already knows. So it makes the question of carrying guns in public to protect yourself from the, you know, the black rapist or the mugger or whatever, which is how a lot of this was sold to people, is probably rather misleading. And the irony then is that when you look at a whole series of high-profile court cases, when women did use guns to defend themselves against men, trying to invoke this whole stand your ground principle, they were prosecuted anyway, because the ground they were supposedly standing on was equally, the man was equally entitled to be there. So the pretext by which women were sold guns to protect themselves, the people they needed to most protect themselves from were already there, and the courts took a very unsympathetic view. I mean, we've seen this over a long time. You know, globally, there's been some good work in Australia about it. There's been work in Britain about women who utilize lethal self-defense against an abusive partner. After many years of victimization, when they snap and fight back, they're then accused of murder because they attack the perpetrator when it's thought to be not a situation of imminent violence. They attack, they get their retaliation in before the kind of very absolute last resort. So I mean, all of this kind of was a sort of familiar story, but I wanted to kind of use it partly to suggest that armed self-defense was not perhaps the best way to make for a safer society. More guns don't make us safer in a general sense, but at the same time to make a sort of gender argument that women were being conned. It was a kind of, I've seen some work in Canada that talked about the pistolization of society. Well, this sort of pistolized feminism is very much a blind alley. I think it's not the solution, and I've lately come across, it's partly as a result of some other work I'm doing on the way in which the police involve themselves in violence against women, apart from the fact that the police are often part of the problem, because they often arrest women for violent acts against partners when all the women were doing were defending themselves. That it fits into, I hadn't come across this until recently, a notion of what's called carceral feminism, that feminism allies itself with neoliberal law enforcement just to increase mass incarceration, and largely it's mass incarceration of poorer, blacker, darker members of society and the women themselves. So this sort of pistolization version of feminism seems to me to be aiding and abetting the growth of the mass incarceration security state, which is not really a solution that any of us would want. And so that's kind of what took it from being a kind of theoretical issue that was a spin-off from other work I'd been doing to having legs of its own. The last point was a very kind of particular point made by Franklin Zimring and his colleagues writing in America. That's my front doorbell going. Writing in America in about 1990, around the time when there was a debate about whether a national handgun strategy could ever come to being in the United States. And Zimring very much argued that women were crucial to the politics of this because men were generally more pro-gun and women were generally more anti-gun. In a way, Zimring said that the whole question of gun politics for the future will be gendered, and it will be gendered around the idea that if women stay opposed to widespread argument, then it's possible to imagine that in the future, a gun control policy that takes in handguns and introduces sensible handgun controls will come about. But if women get swayed to the other side of the picture, then that's not going to happen. And I saw what the NRA were trying to do in terms of refuse to be a victim, expand the market, the women's market in guns was not just a marketing strategy to bail out the gun industry, but it was also a political strategy to propagandize guns for women, to brainwash is probably too strong a word, but to increase women's acceptability of guns so that the politics of gun control could never really come to fruition. So it was big picture, little picture, as well as a detailed story about that has a sort of an aspect of false equality about it. I mean, even in America, which has a less unequal gun distribution than most other places, only about 15% of guns owned in America are owned by women. So that 85% are owned by men, but that's less unequal than the rest of the world. So in a sense, if they could get that 15% higher, then in a way the future of the gun would be much more secured. And I was wanting to build a critique of all of that, both the big picture, the specific picture, the contradictions in selling guns but then still find women guilty of using them, and the sort of ideological manipulation that was going on there, in order to kind of sell the myth that guns will set you free, that guns will make you safe. Yeah, that was about the size of it. So there was a lot of things in there, but
I think this gender perspective is the specific part of the discussion of gun violence that was missing. More in the part, as we say, that we started to discuss on the toxic masculinities, but in the interventions to access, to control, to provide like a specific interventions to cope with gun violence. But also from a long time, I was trying to think about the myths around firearms. And we have some ideas like first, a firearm is a risk in any context. A gun in the house increase the probabilities of domestic violence, on security. So we need to think that women also have a big risk if they have firearms. We have a lot of evidence that people that knows how to use firearms also commits unintentional homicide, suicide. So a gun is a risk. And
Well, that's the point. That's the point too, isn't it? That there are more suicides, or there have until recently been more suicides than homicides. So it's that we need to take seriously too. And I don't think that's been enough part of the picture. I think the balance has been shifting a bit of late in America. But in countries where there are more homicides, it's a different kind of story. But I agree with you.
yes, and the second myth that I debate a lot when I have these programmed debates is that a firearm doesn't dissuade crime. When you have a firearm, for example, it doesn't dissuade from the mass shootings. In any case, there are reports of, I think, Mary Jane that report that the presence of a firearm doesn't dissuade the massive shootings and doesn't dissuade a criminal. And there are biggest possibilities as a firearm is a risk that you are shot with your own firearm. And
Yeah.
women that is carry a firearm in the public space is not protected by the firearm. So I think we need to talk about more about these myths around firearms, including the new myths that is that a woman with a firearm is not more protected against men with that firearm. So I think this is a very important point to start. And I wanted to ask you that was the second question, Peter, that you think that women have a different position or a different relationship with the firearm to men? Men have this perspective of I would have a gun to protect myself, my family, and my community from different actors. Women is protecting itself against men, violent men that could have they are willing to make sexual violence and other things. But how do you think could be the behavior of a woman with a firearm in the street? And as I was saying, in a criminal context, you think that there are some hypotheses that women could be more violent and they could be like more with they could consider more the human rights in context, for example, as conflicts. How is this relationship? Because we haven't seen some documentation on the relationship of women in pandillas, in gangs, that there are mainly like the companion of the chiefs of the gang, but they are starting to be more involved as active actors in
Yeah.
these violent groups. What do you think could be this relationship of the women and the firearm?
Wow. A lot of questions there. What one of the things, I mean, I didn't do enough of it in the book, and I'd originally thought of another chapter because the missing chapter, if you like, was also looking at women's role in gun control, how around the world, whether it be African communities, Latin America, Brazil, Viva Rio, and all of that. Women often took lead roles in gun control organizations. In America, you've got the Million Mom March, and then women's involvement in every town, women's involvement in campaigns against armed domestic violence. There needs to be that recognition, and without slipping into a sort of essentialism whereby women are mothers and about peace and care and control, and men are about macho and patriarchy and power and coercion. I mean, I think those ideologies of gender are still playing a massive part in shaping people's opportunities, experiences, perceptions, and ideas about what they need to do. But the attempt to shift, nothing is being done to disarm men. But what seems to be happening is we're talking about women becoming more armed, and I'm not saying to be more like men, but to kind of it's almost like mutually assured destruction, which used to be the old nuclear power debate, that if we arm women, they'll be safer because we're not going to disarm men. So I don't think there are essential characteristics that men must be like this and women must be like that. But I really don't think that putting technology in the hands of women like that is necessarily really making them any safer, given the kind of roles they play, the assumptions about families and communities. And I'm keen as I am to see communities rendered safer, I don't think pouring more guns into them is the way you do that. So, and it's a bit like a book I've been reading recently about police violence against African Americans. A woman called, I think her name's Elizabeth Hinton, and she's argued that often what black groups did was to get guns so they could fight the police, fight the racist police who were constantly harassing them. But all that did is it just led to yet further kind of oppression of the groups. What we need is rather more community-based, collective strategies to reduce the kind of tensions that guns are meant to solve. So I don't have any real strategies here, except to say that the answers don't lie in pouring guns into a situation, but the answers lie in rather more collective strategies and attempts to overcome tensions and rifts and conflicts that people arm themselves about. Now, in the States, in relation to race, that's pretty obvious. Sorry, you.
Yes, to reduce the demand, I like a lot the perspective of demand and supply of firearms, considering that demand is what are your motivation to access firearms. So we could break these motivations for men, and we could break these motivations for women. There are different patterns of the demand of the firearms, and you can develop interventions in the side of the demand that are like education, communication, and is try to focus on why people is accessing to firearms. And the other side is the supply. Is
Yeah, absolutely.
how you are full of weapons and you can like reduce the number of weapons in the market. So I like it a lot. I don't remember. That was a paper of the Small Observer actually that showed that we could break the market of firearms across demand and supply and the motivations and the rationale of the two and to try to do interventions in the both sides.
But I think some of that uh, uh, breaking the demand is absolutely vital, and in some ways that's happening because the focus, the more education, the more urban, the better off people are, generally speaking, in North America, the less likely they are to own firearms. No, speaking in generalities there, firearms are very much part of a kind of historical culture. It's the South and the West. It's the old race states. It's the old frontier states. Whereas people with what you might call white collar jobs, professional jobs in cities, so both East Coast and West Coast, are less likely to be gun owners than the Midwest and the South and the kind of the old Rust Belt. So gun ownership is falling in the States. It's falling, and it would be falling faster were it not for this constant drip feed about how you need a gun to protect yourself against violent crime and protect yourself against the black underclass, and be a man. I mean that whole thing that was central to the advertising of assault rifles around the time of the Sandy Hook killing. Get your man card back, stand up and be counted. be a real man, own a gun, protect your family. It's real brainwashing. And I think that has a kind of global significance. I certainly think it's a feature of, when Brazil had the referendum on gun control, was it 95? The NRA were very influential in trying to pitch gun ownership as part of a protection agenda for the white middle class. I had a student write a sort of dissertation about it. She was from Brazil, and again she was very active around the time when Bolsonaro came in and was trying to drive the clock back to almost dictatorship years, but very much that whole guns and beef and power politics that was part of a culture that said you must have a gun to protect yourself and everything you stood for in a dangerous world. And I think that's a very compelling argument to people who are fearful, that feel they don't have any control over their life. And you look at the demographic that is most likely to own guns in the state. Often they're ex-military, they're used to guns, they are old men, they are rural, they may have done hunting in the past. But the new handguns for self-defense is all premised upon a racist white fear. The same issue that led to the white flight in the 60s from the cities like Detroit and Chicago. Do you know Jennifer Carlson's work on, I was saying, no, I think so we were talking about the demand, and I think there's a I think that demand has to be constructed. It's sort of artificial demand. People are being told what they need to do, a particular kind of masculinity, historic masculinity that sees itself as the keeper of its families, the keeper of its women, patriarchy. And I think that's why I think Jennifer Carlson's work is interesting, because it sees very much that men are, it's a psychological condition that men are encouraged to cling to power, and clinging to power is via access. I mean, they have the car, they have the gun, they have the higher income. So that this is an element of a patriarchal culture, and in that patriarchal culture, women are there to be protected and to be homemakers. So it's not far from a fairly traditional sexual division of labor, which is changing anyway. And in a sense, one of the arguments always, about what we used to call women's liberation is that what comes with that is also a higher propensity to be involved criminally, less so-called chivalrous protection from the consequences of the law, and in a sense having to kind of make it in the man's world. And all of that is part of this mess that we now call gun culture, that women are being told they need to kind of become more involved in to protect themselves, because she can't rely on men.
Yes. And they have to protect against men.
But it's a construct, isn't it? It's a construct of the gun industry itself.
And the guns control politics haven't introduced these changes in the debate. So that's and in Latin America, it's not a discussion that is not in the field. Maybe yes, I have seen in Europe, in South Africa, but the topic in Latin America is not open for this. It's so important that we could start pushing the discussion. But it's not only women in the home that is in risk. Women in the public space, because they are also accessing to guns, and they are involved in crime. So do you think there are some differences of women in crime with firearms in relation to men, even in the States, in the UK, or in Latin America?
Well, there involvement in crime at many levels, and the there was some work done in the UK. I mean, it's the UK. How relevant it is to Latin America, I'm not sure, but the argument was that men often act out crimes of violence as part of their own personal macho agendas, whereas women's crimes were often about survival and protection of others. So whilst men would rob banks, women would shoplift at the supermarket, and the or involve themselves in check fraud. They would do things to protect family. I mean, and now there's a bit of a stereotype in all of that too, but I didn't get a sense that women's involvement in gun crime was changing very much. There's been a certain amount of talk about women in gangs in certain parts of the country. In certain countries, women involvement in gangs was also increasing. But I never really got a strong sense that this was women significantly increasing their involvement in armed crime. I think I don't think I've seen the research on that, so I don't know whether it exists.
It's
There,
something
there's
that is not known, Peter, and that's one of the focus of Masuru. We did a big seminar in November in Buenos Aires, trying to disentangle this involvement of women because we have a lot of myths. So we have like in Latin America, we have these matronas. For example, we have in Colombia, as you know, we have Griselda that is pictured as the very violent women that is against men. So we have all this caricatura of women involved in crime. I just say Lara Croft, they are like armed women, and I like a lot of this perspective, for example, of Ukraine, that are sexy women with firearm, and this is a lot of the way as women as is portrayed as violent, but they are also subject to many other other characteristics of involvement in crime. I don't know, for example, in Africa, I think they should be very, very complex in context of conflict, but here in Latin America, we have some documentation on the involvement, for example, in gangs in Central America, in Salvador, in Guatemala, in Honduras, when there are everyone is involved, so women start to get as partners. But also we have, for example, in Colombia, some feminism guerrillas. That's a very interesting like groups that we could start to develop. But it's a topic that is not developed in the topic.
yeah.
In
I can see how that's happening, but on a very small scale, I would guess, because it seems to me that the guns are overwhelmingly in the hands of men. The other area I thought of, I didn't really write about, is in the whole area of suicide terrorism, whereby it's often women who are the walking bomb, because they are less likely thought of as less likely to be picked out by security forces. But that's a pretty desperate form of armed woman. And if cartels and gangs and organized crime groups are sort of using women in that way, it seems to
Mhm.
me it's as much a part of a sort of grooming problem.
They're instrumentalized, as you said, in many parts. They are an instrument of
Yeah,
the violence.
of and an instrument of the men who are running the gangs. I mean, there've been a number of writers who've tried to excavate a history of, a hitherto hidden history of women involved in firearms, and I know that that's there. Women as outlaws, the whole Amazon tradition, and as you said, right up to date. During the Vietnam War, Viet Cong, women troops, and now in Ukraine. But there's also that other side of it, that highly sexualized version of women and guns, where women and guns in a whole gun porn area. So there's some very kind of dubious associations between women and guns, who are there more for the titillation of men than anything to do with their own actual interest themselves. So I'm skeptical of some of that, but I haven't seen the research on it.
Yes, that's something that we will push, and I think this conversation, this dialogue, it help us to push, because we are in Latin America in a problem of gun violence. So we really need to disentangle and to break the different patterns and the different ways to do interventions. We need to start to thinking more innovative ways. So that will be including gender as an aspect, gender on violence, and trying to understand what is the role that women can play, as you said, in prevention of gun violence, but also how we could reduce the access of women, even if it's marginal. There is something that adds to that layers of violence.
But if you were seen to be doing that and nothing else, reducing the access of women to guns, I think you would get hammered by the right for exposing women to risk. I mean, the number of times I've done a talk about guns for self-defense, and someone will get up and having sat and listened through your talk and say, well, are you not just letting me be raped? And I think it's very hard to deal with that, because it always comes down to the very last instance.
Yes, it's not an issue to point out. No, it's something to identify that the pattern could exist, and in context with increasing levels of violence. So, for example, in Ecuador, that is a country that was in the position below the 20th most violent countries, and for the homicide monitor, the calculations, it was now the second country with the highest homicide rate, only with Jamaica in the top. So we have these steps, increases of violence, and we have Mexico, and we have cities in Brazil. We need to try to understand what is the role of women. So the final question, Peter, is, and you develop a lot this is, what do you think that are the specific interventions on gun violence that would consider this gendered perspective to guns control? We talk about demand, but we could think at how women, as they are less prone to access to firearms, could be like more, like they could be portrayed in campaigns to recover firearms. What do you think could be these gender perspectives to guns control, considering this position of women?
Wow. I mean, this has become, for me, a much more complicated question, because as I was talking earlier about the whole idea of carceral feminism, one of the last things you want to do is introduce gun controls that empower the police and security forces even more than they are at the moment, because they have a pretty bad record for their rather selective and often racist and discriminatory application of the law. We recently had a major case in the UK where a police officer kidnapped a woman and raped and killed her. And it's opened up a real can of worms about misogyny in police forces themselves. And the one thing that this inquiry found was that because we don't have routinely armed policing in Britain, what was found in this national inquiry was that the armed units within policing were the most macho, most patriarchal, most misogynistic, most violent military of any police units. So the problem of saying to police forces is, we want you to do more about guns in poor communities, is that you just transfer more power to a group of police and security forces that you don't trust anyway. And I think that in a way women's organizations and community organizations have to be very careful in terms of the agreements or the arrangements they make for liaison with state forces, because they can turn around and bite them in a very bad way. I think something has to be done in terms of who can lawfully own guns, but the problem with who can lawfully own guns is that you then transfer the problem to a load of criminal guns that are not licensed, not regulated at all. So at least with lawfully owned guns, you might know who's got them and where they are. If you try to impose too tough gun control, all you do is you just ship them out
It's the
to
market, yes.
no one knows where. Um, so I think there's a strong case for, if you like, kind of network and neighborhood and community intelligence. People have to be willing to anonymously report. Like there used to be about child abuse cases. There should be a line people can call to say there's an illegal gun somewhere. But the trouble is then the police are going to come in and raid it to find it. And that again could be more problematic. I think there were some interesting examples in a number of African societies about getting guns out of houses, out of communities, but it was a lot of kind of it almost classic demobilization, disarmament work within communities, incentivizing people to get rid of guns and buy farming and household equipment. Right. So some kind of transfer, technology transfer, but we'll take your gun, but we'll give you a new cooker or a new fridge or something. So it's anything to reduce the overall number of guns and to increase surveillance of them at a community level. But I think they're still quite problematic because they often involve working with the state. So I think you need active community, third sector organizations working there that can develop a level of trust and confidence outside the state, and but have the kind of capacity to do this sort of work.
Yes.
But it's a long shot. It's difficult. And
yes, it is. I think my perspective, Peter, on that field is starting with the more involvement of women in all the treats and all the international discussions of firearms. And as we said, women are more involved in the ATT, in the arms treaty. We already have like gender violence as a risk factor that could allow a country to not get a license to export firearms. So in the international field, and also we have some references that the involvement of women in peace accords is like the key aspect to the peace accord to be long lasting. And we have this in Liberia and also in Colombia. I think this is the first part. And the second part is the involvement of to put together guns controlling the take out the firearms in the cases when men is related to gun violence and domestic violence. So to put in line the interventions to reduce feminicide and guns. In the presence, if you have a house when you have some ideas that you could have violence, domestic violence, you retreat the firearm of the house. And this is like the top of the discussion on guns control and gender in Latin America, is to relate with the perspective, with the policies to reduce feminicide. And on the part of the discussions, on try to disentangle and to include this gender perspective in campaigns and communications. I think this is like what we are doing now. But as you say, we could not put women at risk and trying to put the women more in front of the discussion. So, Peter, I think that was the question we had. I
I
appreciate
was
a
just, I
lot
was
your time.
what I'm worried about slightly is I come at this as a criminologist, and I think this debate is not about individual crimes and individual incidents and abuses. This is a question about almost global and national politics, and somewhere between the two, the kind of the incident on the ground that shows there's a problem has to be connected up
Eh,
with and I don't feel very good. I've never been really I'm a member of the UK gun control network, which formed after Dunblane, but we don't have that big a problem. But countries that do have a big problem, I think, as you're saying, organisations like Small Arms Survey and yeah, I answer other kind of disarmament groups have got a handle on the much bigger picture. We those needed to be connected up. I mean, I think things like uh, anyone with a domestic violence arrest cannot own a firearm. Anyone with a gang background cannot own a firearm. Anyone with a drug problem, and the gun has to be seen as almost community property. So if a man wants to own a gun, he's got to talk to his neighbours to get them to say, "Oh, we're moving towards this in the UK. If a man wants a firearm license." He's got to talk to his partner. She's got to agree. If there are children in the house, she's definitely got to agree. Neighbours need to be okay with it. A doctor needs to know, and the kind of information systems need to be able to talk to one another so that
Peter, in Argentina, there is a system that when someone wants to access to a firearm, they appear in a public list, and people could refuse. Could no, this person could access to firearms, and the biggest number of refuses comes from women that they say no, this man cannot have a firearm. So these
right.
are like simple interventions that could be developed to say there is a public list of people that wants to access a firearm, so everyone knows a legal gun, no?
So that is absolutely the right kind of thing. I read. I mean, my colleague Roxana, who was from Recife in Brazil, told me that during the time of the kind of referendum in Brazil, that there was also women formed a kind of almost went on sex strike, that they denied their I mean that kind of grassroots widespread politicization of an issue
In Colombia
seems to me
too.
I I don't really know whether it worked or whether it was a gimmick, but it's a way of taking it beyond just a question of my gun, my right to have it, but almost rendering yourself accountable in the context of owning something that really changes the power relations between you and anybody else around you who doesn't have a gun. I think it's the ownership of these things needs to be accountable. It needs to be regulated, and like you say, it needs to be visible so that people can raise the question about it. And we don't even have that in this country, which talks about itself as a safe society. And yet the irony of it is like in America, they've got this misunderstood right to bear arms, um, which people latch onto and feel is their God-given right. I mean, and you will know yourself that when the UN was looking at the program of action on small arms, America was refusing to sign and talking about the global right to own a gun, as if the Second Amendment was a global entitlement. I mean, and somehow saw the UN as almost changing the American Constitution. There's so much myth here that I despair of ever getting a sensible conversation on it with with the other side, because they are so implacably committed to the idea of this as an individual right issue. I did a debate with Wayne Lapierre, who used to be the executive vice president of the NRA, and his starting line was, "The only people who have ever been free have been armed people. You know, guns will set us free." And whilst people sort of start from that point, I worry that we'll ever get to a more sensible. Particularly while states endorse that kind of view. Anyway, well,
Okay, Peter, so thank you a lot.
no, it'd be good. It'd be great to talk. We should